Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this event organized by the Amsterdam Center for European Studies. We have a great company today here with us. We have the editors of the book and some of the authors who will be talking about the book and their chapters. The book is called Resisting Europe. And it conceptualizes the foreign policies of Europe towards the states in its immediate so-called southern neighborhood, as semi-imperial attempts to turn these states into Europe's southern buffer zone or borderlands. This book examines the diverse modalities by which states in the Mediterranean, Middle East, and North Africa reject, resist, challenge, modify, or entirely change European policies and preferences, and it also provides rich empirical evidence of these contestation practices in the fields of migration and border control, banking and finance, democracy promotion, and telecommunication. The book addresses the complex question of when and how Middle East and North Africa states capitalize on their own leverage and interdependence in their relationships with Europe, and contributes to a more comprehensive understanding of Europe-Middle East relations while engaging with broader debates on power and interdependence, order and contestation in international relations. Some of the questions which the book addresses and explains and analyzes are why and how do Middle East and North Africa states contest European policy, modes and norms, which policies are particularly prone to contestation, and under which circumstances do processes of contestation occur, and what are the broader implications for all this. My name is Dimitris Bouris, and I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. And I'm joined by the two editors of the book, Professor Rafaela Del Sarto and Dr. Simone Tollens. Professor Rafaela Del Sarto is Associate Professor of Middle East Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, SES Europe in Bologna. She is the author of Borderlands, Europe and the Mediterranean Middle East, which is forthcoming by Oxford University Press. Israel Under Siege, The Politics of Insecurity and the Rise of the Israeli Neo-Revisionist Right, Georgetown University Press. And also Contested State Identities and Regional Security in the Euro-Mediterranean Area. Welcome, Rafaela. Also the second co-editor, Dr. Simone Tollens, who is a senior lecturer in international relations at Cardiff University, an associate fellow at Johns Hopkins University SES Europe, and also currently a visiting fellow at the European University Institute. Her publications on intervention and contestation include Winning the Post-War, Norm Localization, and Small Arms Control in Kosovo and Cambodia, as well as Border Management in an Era of State Building Light, Security Assistance, and Lebanon's Hybrid Sovereignty. We're also joined by two of the authors of this book, Dr. Véronique Wavre and Dr. Ashley O'Kay, and I will introduce them briefly as well. Véronique Wavre is postdoctoral researcher at University of St. Gallen at School of Economics and Political Science. Her recent publications include Policy Diffusion and Telecommunications Regulation. She recently also released the short documentary video, Citizens Offline, the State, the Telecom Companies, and Internet Shutdown. And last but not least, Ashley Selina Kay, who is a senior fellow at the Instituto Affari Internazionali in Rome. Her publications include Turkey post-2011 approach to its Syrian border and its implications for domestic policies, as well as the leverage of the gatekeeper power and interdependence in the migration nexus between the European Union and Turkey. Thank you all for making the time to be with us today and for accepting our invitation to present this book and some of these chapters. I don't want to take more of your time, but the way that we will go is that Simone will present the book for 5 minutes. Then I'll give the floor to Veronique and Tassili to present their chapters, and then Rafaela will provide us with some concluding thoughts based on the project. Simone and Rafaela will have 5 minutes each, Veronique and Tassili will have 10 minutes each, and I'll try to be as strict as possible so that we have enough time for questions and answers. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box and not the chat function. So please put them there and we will be reading them. Without any further ado, Simone, the floor or the Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you, Dimitris. Thank you so much for inviting us to present this book to the Amsterdam Center for European Studies. So I'll just say a few words about the starting point of this book and the framework that we developed. So the book is an outcome of the Borderlands project that was funded by the European Research Council and hosted at the European University Institute and directed by Raffaella Del Sarto from 2011 to 2017. And at the Borderlands project, and where I myself worked as a research associate for a period of that time, and at the Borderlands project, we studied the kind of dense cooperation frameworks and mechanisms and that exist in the Euro-Mediterranean area. As a part of that study, studying very much the kind of overlapping functional borders that the European Union is exporting to its southern neighborhood, we kind of grew increasingly, let's say, dissatisfied with some of the existing frameworks that was used to capture what is kind of going on in that area. First of all, with the European external governance kind of perspectives that we found often quite unidirectional, certainly interested primarily in kind of evaluating formal adoption of specific rules and norms. But perhaps also with the kind of perspective of Europe as a normative or a civilian power, which we found very much sort of ignore this kind of hegemonic undertones. And certainly that whole perspective is quite reminiscent of a sort of civilizing mission, as also Yanis Sivaktis lays out in his contribution to the book. So we were interested in kind of looking a little bit more about what is really going on, as it were, and perhaps kind of tip a little bit the perspective in the favor of the so-called southern neighborhoods. And I will continue to see the so-called southern neighborhoods. We in this book, we might refer to MENA states, but in the book we try to also be more specific and say Mediterranean Middle East, because it does exclude obviously the Gulf states and so on. So we were then interested in sort of how contestation takes place, and that whole approach to that European Union has first of all laid out Europeanization within the European Union, then towards the eastern neighborhood, where obviously there are clear kind of pathways for candidate countries to reach membership status. What's happening in the southern neighborhood is very much an extension of that, but that is quite paradoxical, because those countries are, certainly not looking at any kind of near future candidate or EU member states membership. So despite that, exactly, there are a lot of the same frameworks. So, okay, the book then is trying to bring a more nuanced, let's say, and grounded perspective of what happens between, let's say, compliance and rejection, right? And sort of enter into an exploration of why MENA states and the way that MENA states engage with and negotiate and contest European external governance. And we do so, first of all, by drawing on a borderlands perspective, where the kind of disaggregation of functional borders as a result of the EU's rule promotion approach itself entails treating the EU as an empire of sorts, where a core is connected to a periphery. Now, we were including also Miguel Gravier, who has a chapter in our book on core-periphery relations. So I wasn't planning on saying a whole lot about that, but it is important to note that a borderlands perspective allows for treating this kind of Euro-Mediterranean area as a shared site of political interaction and develop a framework of contestation, not as mere rejection necessarily, but rather as practices that engage with external norms in also potentially productive ways. So this kind of interactive and interrelational view of norms brings us to develop a practice framework for the purpose of the book. And we locate contestation in such practices, those kind of actual and everyday doings and sayings of fields of actors. And it brings us beyond kind of macro narratives or that often define the formal representation of what's going on in Euro-Mediterranean relations, and to sort of what is actually going on and how the norms and these macro narratives come to life through micro practices. So we then seek to conceptualize resistance through such practices, and that requires us to ask kind of new questions and approach this issue of order and power in new ways. So to understand better how MENA states contest European norms and rules, we kind of differentiate or distinguish between different types. We have developed kind of 4 ideal types. They are certainly not mutually exclusive, and they're also not that set, and that's what Raffaella will reflect on later. There are some interesting also new findings in how we did it. First of all, we're building on Adler, Nissen, and Poliot, distinguishing between thick and thin forms. And to some extent, this is artificial, and there might be a continuum, but I think it's also, we thought it would be purposeful to look at it, where thick contestation is questioning the very definition of competence, and as well as the legitimacy of the actors claiming that competence. Thin contestation, on the other hand, will accept kind of basic criteria for competence, but contest the relative position within particular settings. We also propose to think about, let's say, overt or explicit forms of contestation and hidden. And here we might see some different stuff, for example, where explicit would be more explicit in discourse. Hidden scripts of contestation may be found in these kind of everyday practices of localizing externally derived norms. So the result is then that we have a framework where we are, I think the authors have been able to engage and unpack really the various forms of contestation that takes place as European rules meet MENA realities, as it were, and also unbound this kind of material asymmetries that's assumed to shape and structure interactions. So I won't outline the questions again, because Dimitris did a fine job in doing that. So with that kind of basic introduction to the framework and the book, I pass over to the 2 of our authors that will share insights from their specific policy areas.
Thank you, Simone. And I know that it's always mission impossible to try and summarize everything, a whole book project in 5 to 7 minutes. But I think you did a great job in doing this very concisely as well. One of the things that I personally found very interesting was this idea of contestation as a norm-generating practice. But maybe we can come back to this after the presentations as well. Veronique, would you like to take the Zoom floor?
Yes, and hello everyone. I'm Veronique Gravier, and I'm a postdoctoral student or fellow at the University of St. Gallen. I wrote this chapter with Tina Freiburg, who is professor of comparative politics, but it's based on one of the findings of my thesis that I wrote that we thought was the most interesting. So our chapter is called Leapfrogging the EU, Telecommunications Regulation in Morocco. And what was our driving motivation there was that often in research, we can see that we talk of asymmetry in the EU-Morocco relationship in favor of the EU, and we felt it was unsatisfying. Morocco is no empty shell, and there are proofs of resistance to EU efforts of extending its normative power. And the case we selected, so universal service obligation, one of the subfields of telecommunication regulation, exemplifies this. And even in this case, it goes even further, because the policy that Morocco has developed even is more daring than what the EU proposes as a baseline. So in this case, we can even see leapfrogging policymaking from Morocco. So we're thinking maybe we could observe the rise of ENP partners, so European Neighborhood Partnership partners, as more balanced partners to the EU. So that was an interest we had to dig in this case. Morocco is specifically interesting in this case because it is so close to the EU in terms of trade, in terms of EU support. It's an advanced country, an advanced partner to the EU. So often research would expect EU to just take over what the EU suggests. So we expect Morocco to upload policies and just do as it is told and just show its goodwill to be part of this relationship by implementing things. But it's not the case. And as we can see in this case of telecommunications regulation, specifically universal service obligation regulation, we can see that Morocco contests the EU and proposes new policies, daring policies. And it did so by getting its inspiration from Latin American models. Our guiding questions there were, for example, what explains the contestation of Morocco of the European model in universal service obligation, and what explains this leapfrogging event? Under which conditions do partner countries contest EU regulation? And in terms of theory, so we digged in this book with this idea of external governance, and we focused on this aspect of the functional appropriateness of EU rules. So if you think of the European Neighborhood Partnership, in this way, it aims at strengthening bilateral relations on negotiated basis through extending parts of the EU acquis communautaire to its immediate neighbors. So this global aim is typical external governance, and can be seen that it varies across countries, regions, policy fields, can be measured differently in terms of at the level of rule selection, rule adoption, rule application. We focused on rule selection, and we digged in this body of literature. There are several explanations that exist to explain a little bit. There are several explanations that explain how rule selection can take place. One of them is the institutionalist explanation, so focusing on the institutional power of the EU in relation to Morocco, how linked they are. And then there is this power-based explanation saying that the more a country is depending on the EU, the more it's gonna just upload policies. So actually, in this context, you should expect Morocco to upload these policies. But actually, it isn't. These theories, these explanations are frustrating because they do not account for cases where rule selection does not take place, despite all this, despite high institutionalization, despite high independence of the EU, despite this high trade, this high funding that Morocco receives. So this was the moment where we came into this third idea, this third perspective, this functional appropriateness explanation. And there we see that actually the relationship depends also on the compatibility between the EU rules and the existing domestic rules and practices. So here we start to think about conditions of effective rule selection. In other words, the country's economic and administrative autonomy and openness towards the EU, as well as the level of anticipated domestic cost of adoption matter. And it's interesting because it really shows that Morocco matters. These selecting countries matter. And it's also interesting because, yes, you may think that high costs to adopt a policy may explain that you will not adopt the policy or you will not select it. But if you have anticipated low costs, it does not necessarily explain that you will or result in you adopting the EU rules. And this is especially the case if the country seeks, for example, emancipation, and that the functional appropriateness of the rules is put into question. So here our argument was functionally motivated contestation is a window of opportunity to manifest emancipative ambitions. I told you that we were looking into universal service obligation. What is this actually? So we decided to focus on this subfield of telecom because it's a very national field of telecommunication policies. It means that the state is going to put together some policies that ensure that all the citizens in your territory, in your country, have access to affordable ICT connections. So affordable telephone network, affordable internet, functional internet networks. So it's typically policies that are limited to your country. So you have total autonomy to do it. There is only limited international political and economic interests. No international framework exists that force a country to do this or that. Everybody can do as they like. They can do nothing if they want. So we were interested in this field because there is no international pressure for Morocco to do one thing or the other. It's typically a case of low risk, and there is no political cost. And so we were interested to understand what Morocco does in autonomy with that. And we decided to compare the baseline, the European baseline, with what exists in the Latin American case, and what Morocco decided to upload. And actually, what is the situation is that in Europe, the baseline is a direct allocation. It means that the incumbent provider is the universal service obligation provider. So it means, for example, in France, you would have France Telecom as the provider for the whole country. So it received the mandate. In Latin America, it's different. It means that all the companies that provide telephony can propose projects to implement this mandate. So the company that proposed the most daring or interesting and cheap project will receive the mandate. So it's competitive allocation, it is called. And what is the baseline in Europe is fixed line, so only the fixed services, whereas in Latin America, it's the technology neutral, as is in Morocco. And what we understood is that Morocco did not like this French model of direct allocation based on fixed line, because it made no sense for Morocco in terms of its existing infrastructure and the structure of the market. In countries like Peru or Morocco, the mobile phone is the currency. It's not fixed lines. The networks for fixed line are not developed as they are in European countries that are smaller and that are very, very dense in terms of infrastructure. So we could see that Morocco had very similar patterns of development to Peru, not France, and followed actually what Peru implemented. So that was the one thing that it was very clear with the context, the development of the context, the conditions of the state. So this work we did based on several structured interviews that I did. We based it on primary sources, secondary sources, but I'm not going to go into it because it's too long. But what I wanted to say to conclude this whole experience, this whole example of Morocco, who actually inspired itself mostly from Latin American experience compared to the French experience, is that we could really see an emancipation, a willing emancipation from Morocco, from the European model. So away from it, willingly, saying it repeatedly to France, no, we don't want to discuss this anymore because it does not make sense for us. We saw that there was a similar problem situation with Latin America, which became this major source of inspiration for Morocco. And at the end, we saw that what Morocco implemented was even more daring than what the EU had done at the start. So we could observe several things, but we could see that there is a south-south trend of discussion, communication, inspiration, and also a south-north, because southern countries are getting more and more inspiring for northern countries. So there is this reversing of inspiration. And so our arguments hold. Functionally motivated contestation is a window of opportunity to manifest emancipative ambitions. So this is what we did. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Veronique, and thank you for staying within the time limit as well. Much appreciated. I would like to go from Morocco to Turkey and give the Zoom floor to Asli.
Thank you, Dimitris. Thanks to you all organizers for giving us the opportunity, and big thanks to Rafael and Simone too for patiently and meticulously bringing this collective work to fruition. So within the broader context of the book focusing on contestation, power, interdependence, which Simone has already explained very nicely, my chapter looks into the interaction between the EU and Turkey on border management, and in particular on the process of the EU's efforts to extend its rules and policy prescriptions, its border governance model that is found its expression, let's say, in the integrated border management model. And I look into the period between the early 2000s when this all started and up until the so-called refugee crisis in 2015 to 16. And the analysis is based mainly on the research I conducted within the Borderlands project, actually, that Simone mentioned over the 2015-16 period, with desk research, primary, secondary resources, and also interviews. So the main premise on which the analysis is built up is exactly the point of this interaction not being a unidirectional transfer from the EU of rules and policies, but more we should look into this interaction as a process in which both sides actively negotiate convergence, how and where convergence should occur, and on the terms of who, let's say. And in overall terms, I look into the modality of engagement, framing this relationship, and also the power asymmetry, changing, let's say, the dynamics of the relationship. And by modality of engagement, here we have a bit of an odd case out, as it is always the case with Turkey. I refer to the policy instruments, incentives and levers deployed by the EU to structure the interaction, let's say, so as to extend its rules and policies. And here the odd case out of Turkey is that we have two periods where in one, the accession framework has dominated differently to other MENA states. And in the other modality, let's say, where the accession framework with its comprehensive incentives and reform agenda faded out, and where the border management, a reform agenda focused mainly and more narrowly on migration, not exclusively, but mainly on migration and border management issues, was sought by the EU. And in exchange of that, visa liberalization and facilitation was offered as the main incentive, let's say. And in terms of power asymmetry, the main idea the chapter develops and the case illustrates to us is that we should look into this power asymmetry not in a static and absolute terms, let's say, but we should focus on contingent shifts in interdependence dynamics between the two sides, which might occur only in one specific issue area, policy issue area, but which might at the same time skew, let's say, or reverse the overall power asymmetry, which generally favors the EU. Time doesn't allow me to delve into the details of what externally promoted integrated border management model entails, but it would be in place to say that from the beginning, when the IBM model entered the Turkish context, let's say, there has been some main points of divergence between the two sides in terms of what the model suggests and in terms of how Turkey, let's say, wanted to read, operationalize and adopt this model, let's say. And at the risk of oversimplification, three main points can be perhaps highlighted. On the one hand, the IBM's idea of managing the borders through making them act as smart filters, sifting desired movement from undesired movement of goods and people, let's say, and without resorting to physical hardening and sealing off of borders, if possible. And as opposed to Turkey's understanding of using physical hardening when and as necessary, protecting the borders through that. And a second one, the high priority irregular migration and stopping irregular migration, and the borders function as mainly acting as to stop irregular migration, let's say, in the IBM model, promoted by the IBM model, as opposed to Turkey's approach of, okay, this is one of the problems, but possibly not the problem, and that predominance of also terrorism linked hard security or conversional security threats, and the borders function to thwart these, let's say. And a third one was much more on the IBM's idea of centralization of border management tasks and powers in the hands of a single professional and ideally civilian organization, versus the institutional setting in Turkey predominated, and where the relevance and dominance of military actors are high, and the institutional setting is much more fragmented, let's say. So how have the chapter basically looks at how these points of divergence have been negotiated between the two sides in this period of 15 years. And looking into these two factors, let's say, modality of engagement and power asymmetry, and I identify three main phases. In the first one, in the early 2000s, where the accession framework dominated, and Turkey's key role as an actor sustaining the EU system of migration control was not yet as visible, was visible but not as visible. Second, from roughly 2010 onwards, roughly, the accession framework lost its relevance and credibility, and the modality in terms of enforcing or fostering reform in the area of IBM has centered more on the visa liberalization carrot, let's say, and that framework, and which this period, unsurprisingly, actually also coincided with Turkey's growing importance in the as a key actor in the EU system of migration control. And third, I look into the specific years of so-called refugee crisis, where the visa liberalization centered modality remained relevant or as the main framework, while at the same time the relationship acquired a more political and transactional nature, and EU's dependence on Turkey's cooperation has deepened. And in a nutshell, what are the key takeaways from these three phases is that even if in the first period the accession framework dominated, and both the power of the asymmetry of power and the modality of engagement favored somehow the EU to foster and enforce comprehensive compliance, Turkey actually also in this period engaged in thin or hidden forms of contestation through, for example, adopting an open-ended model, conditioning it to the reforms that it would make to the progress of the membership prospects, etc. In the second period, where the accession framework died off, let's say, Turkey made it much clearer that IBM compliance, as in other areas, would be selective, as it fits its purposes and its understandings and needs, let's say, while it formally continued to comply with the model and reforming its border management system according to the model. Inertia and deprioritization of certain key features of this model has been used, I argue, as forms of contestation. And during the refugee crisis, what we see is a reversed power asymmetry based on this changed interdependence, shifted interdependence dynamics, let's say. In this period, this period allowed Turkey to further reinterpret IBM in line with its understanding and needs. This time also with the approval of and even the blessing of the EU, actually, because the urgency felt by the EU to obtain results in terms of stemming the flows made it to lower its standards in terms of what it means successful and comprehensive compliance with the IBM model. But at the same time, beyond toleration of partial compliance or reinterpretation, let's say, the EU in fact has actively contributed to the watering down of its own model, let's say, and reinterpretation by legitimizing Turkey's deviation from seemingly core features of the IBM model, such as, for example, avoiding physical hardening of the borders, which I can come to later on. And to finish, I'd like to highlight just 3 points. First, even when the power asymmetry and engagement modality largely favors the EU, as it is the case in the accession framework, the so-called recipient states engage in forms of contestation. Especially, I think there we can differentiate between areas possibly of where the reform is sought, especially in politically sensitive areas such as border management, where the stakes are high, and I think we can see forms of contestation, especially in this kind of areas. Second, as I said, the margin for partial compliance, reinterpretation, or localization broadens when shifting interdependence dynamics, even if it's just in one single issue area, lead to reversals of power asymmetries at the overall level. And finally, coming back to the borderlands perspective, the EU's way of dealing with the so-called southern neighborhood leads to partial delegation of governance responsibilities to the, again, quote-unquote, periphery. And this delegation actually provides fertile ground for such reversals of asymmetry, as the case of Turkey shows. And this, in turn, opens up space for successful contestation by the periphery. The periphery strikes back, let's say, while potentially leading the EU to actively contribute to morphing somehow its own policy prescriptions. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Asli. And I would like to give the floor to Magali, but before doing this, I would like to properly introduce her as well. So Miguel Gravier is Associate Professor of Political Science at Copenhagen Business School, Department of Management, Society and Communication. Her recent publications include a co-edited special issue of Journal of Political Power, Imperial Power and the Organization of Space in Europe and North Africa, and Imperial Governance, Governing Inwards or Outwards, published in Geopolitics as well. Magali, I'm glad you managed to join us, and I'm glad you are here with us. The Zoom floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. And I really, really apologize for joining in late. I hope I will compensate by a little PowerPoint presentation. We have received an email telling us how to organize our our setup for the conference. I don't quite follow what they said because I have 3 screens. So my camera is here, but I look up here when I check on the screen, and part of my PowerPoint presentation is here. So my eyes shift. It's not that I'm not concentrated on what you guys are saying, and I'm just checking on my 3 screens. So I'm going to I thought about what I should present, and I had the choice between doing a summary of the chapter and doing more something like a trailer, and I went more for the trailers, so a kind of a teaser on what the chapter is about without going for a full summary of the chapter, because sometimes the trailer is what motivates you to go and see the movie, so that might motivate you to go and check the book itself. That said, I'm going to try to share the PowerPoint presentation. So let's focus here on my PowerPoint presentation. And so the chapter that I wrote for this book is called Petits arrangements avec l'Empire, reflections on imperial power at its fringes. This is inspired from Petits arrangements avec la mort, a French movie, I think. This was the task that I had been given by Rafaela, which is a conceptual piece. So this is not really, you should not expect any empirical data or facts or otherwise, but rather an attempt to reflect on empire, on EU as an empire in the particular context that was interesting for the Borderlands project, which is a focus on MENA countries. So what do I try to do in this chapter? First of all, I try to see empire from the point of view of power. You might say, well, this is pretty evident, but in the world of EU and empire, we actually don't always conceptualize empires in terms of power, but rather in terms of structure. So here, this is actually stepping away from my comfort zone of trying to study empire as a polity, and therefore from the structural points of view, following somebody like Alexander Motel, and to a certain extent, some of the works of Jan Zielonka, and going back to something which is a more traditional way of dealing with empire, empire that's the imperial, the Latin imperium, and this is the concept of power. So here maybe more closer to somebody like Doyle in his book published in 1986 on empire. So this is a bit what the angle that I try to take in this chapter. I also try to go beyond traditional approaches that on empires that mainly see empires as relations between a core and peripheries, but a type of relation in which only one-way relations take place, and these one-way relations are, well, maybe I'm going to start by the second bullet point, by centripetal flows. In other words, flows that go from where the peripheries sending stuff to the center, because the center, or the core, we use both words when we talk about empires, cores and centers. As Doyle puts it, empires are seen as polities where the core controls the effective political sovereignty of another political society, and therefore is able to tap, so to speak, resources from the peripheries. And this is a standard way of taking a look at empires. What I'm interested in this chapter, what I'm interested in is trying to go a little bit beyond, not to say that this does not take place, obviously this takes place, but go beyond that and take a look at other aspects of empires, which are less theorized, but you can find them in a few studies on more contemporary studies on empires. And the idea here is to give more space to what you could call bargainings between cores and peripheries, and mechanisms, flows that rebalance power relations between cores and peripheries, to show that it's not just the core that is tapping the peripheries, the core that is crushing down peripheries, but peripheries can bargain back, can bargain back, and therefore we can talk about centrifugal flows. In other words, where the core is giving to the peripheries, because the peripheries are in a position where they can ask for something and get it. In this chapter, I also focus on what I call small contestations. In other words, I oppose the small contestations to big contestations. Big contestations are these big clashes that lead to secession. So that's Egypt leaving the Byzantine Empire. That's Brexit, the UK leaving the EU. Those are big contestations, major issues, and the empire breaks up on or partly breaks it, loses a part of its territory on such level of contestation. Small contestations, which is what we've been talking about, are these little moments where the peripheries kind of fight back, disagree a bit with the rule that's coming in from the center. And what happens are these small arrangements where peripheries and the core, so in the case of the EU, and the case that we're interested in here, the EU and the MENA countries, settle for things that are not exactly what the core wanted, but something that comes more or less, depending on the case, more or less close to what the EU wants, and that satisfies the peripheries. So those are these small arrangements, these bargaining moments between peripheries and the core, where there's something that's taking place. So I have this figure in my chapter, which I like very much because it took me a lot of time to make it, first of all. And I have also added something that's not in the book, which is the blue part of the figure. So this is a bit of a complicated figure. What it represents is so the main part will be maybe this gray zone here, the empire we're talking about. So the one we focus on when I try to analyze and conceptualize empires. So the structure of the empire is traditionally having strangely enough, my sharing tool doesn't necessarily like my laser pointer, which appears and disappears on the screen. Sorry for that. But in any case, we have at the center of this gray potato, we have the core of the empire. We have towards the outer rim, but still inside, we have what we might want to call the periphery. And then we have here on these round irregular forms that are crossed. So I'm a bit puzzled because my laser pointer doesn't work. I don't know why. I think it's because it's an imported Word document pasted in PowerPoint and it doesn't like it. In any case, these kind of irregular potatoes, those are external territories. So they would be, in our case, the MENA countries, right? So these territories that are around the empire, that are very close to it, that have more or less privileged relations to the empire, but will never really be part of it unless the empire expands much. And the neighboring regions to these external territories, so the very outer rim of the empire, they actually are the ones that might leave the empire if the empire shrinks. So here I in the chapter I actually put both of them in a common category, which I call the fringes of the empire, because even if the furthest periphery of the empire and the closest external territory are separated by a border, they might change their position depending on if the empire shrinks or expands. So those are these French territories. What they have is that they are in some kind of power relation to the empire, but a power here, the arrow, the color code is a bit important here. What it tries to symbolize is that the power of the core, the rules when they leave the core, are black, so they're very dense in terms of color. And as they reach the periphery, they get very light in color. In other words, they lose power. They decay power. So the big idea in this whole chapter is to theorize something that you could call power decay. In other words, the fact that as power travels through space and in time, it decays, it loses in intensity, it loses its power, it loses its force due to things that I call frictions. And these frictions, they can be of various nature: economic or financial factors, cultural, historical, identity factors, political, institutional factors, temporal factors. The more it takes time to travel to the periphery, the more the message is gonna be transformed of sorts. And this is what I have on this slide, and does not appear in the book. Imperial competition. So this is this thing here, this bugger, the next core, the next big power that competes over the same territories, over the same fringe territories in the empire. So we could have here, for instance, this could be Morocco. This could be Morocco. We could have as a blue imperial core, we could have the US, and the gray one would be the EU. So we have the EU and the US both competing over some kind of influence in Morocco. And this is a bit of a nice situation for the periphery, because the periphery has a choice between several imperial rules. And that would be one of the reasons for trying to accommodate just a little bit, as much as you need to please the EU core, and just a little bit on the other side to please the American core. So you'd have actually a little bit of both advantages when you're a periphery and you want to join an empire, because this is about wanting to join an empire. This is not about empires in the older days that, well, even in the older days, sometimes peripheries were forced into an empire, but sometimes they wanted to join to benefit from the wealth of the empire. So there are these two ways of, two reasons for joining an empire. Sometimes you don't have a choice, you lost on a conflict, but sometimes you want the wealth. You want something that the empire has because it's a big power and that you can't have because you're a tiny power. So if you can benefit from imperial competition, as I call it, this is another source of friction that will explain power decay. So here, power decay is at the very core of what I try to conceptualize in this chapter. So what I'm trying to, I guess, what I'm trying to do in this chapter is that I'm trying to conceptualize how and why empires and their fringes settle for power and authority issues in the form of petits arrangements, of small arrangements, because they both seem to agree on that. They both seem to settle on that. And what I try to do in the chapter, and those will be my last words because I think my 10 minutes are up. I try to explain what is in it for the cores. Why would cores accept these small arrangements, but also what's in it for the peripheries? Why do they accept to join an empire if it's only to implement partially the rules that the empire wants, that the core wants to impose on them? Now, that's a very core vision of the power relation. If they want to join us, why don't they want to implement the whole rules? But maybe peripheries have another way of seeing things. And if you want to know the answer to these questions, why don't you just go and take a look at the book? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Magali, and I think that's the best way to end this kind of presentation. It is a book which is definitely worth purchasing for everyone who is interested in all these debates. All the chapters and the editorship of the book are of great quality, so I would encourage everyone to go and explore this book and all the chapters as well. Rafaela, I'm giving you the floor. I know it's probably the most difficult thing to try and summarize all this, but you have done this already, so I hope it's not a big challenge, but just some food for thought or some thoughts from your side, and then we can open up the discussion with the audience. If you have any questions already, please start putting them in the Q&A. Rafaela, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Dimitris, and thank you all for attending this seminar, and thanks to our great contributors to the book. So yeah, summing up or concluding. So the contributions to the volume have shown that MENA states exert their agency in very different ways, no? And that contestation is really a practice in which both sides participate. So what are the main findings of the book? So a few points on contestation in the relationship between Europe and MENA states. So first of all, first point, since the expansion of the European order proceeds through conditionality, resistance in the peripheries is both accepted and expected. And I think that it's an integral part of the relationship between the core and peripheries, if we want to put it in these terms. And that was what Magali just explained and what her chapter deals with. And we have another chapter that makes a similar point by Yannis Stivaktis. Second point, contestation occurs both at the macro level, but also at the micro level. So we have seen that contestation, for example, takes place with regard to European economic policies. That is a chapter by Raymond Hinnebusch on Syria. We have seen that there's plenty of resistance of MENA states to European policies on migration, but there's also opposition to rather technical rules. And that was Veronique's chapter, Veronique and Tina's chapter on telecommunications, but also, for example, on banking regulations, right? Third point, the contributions to our book show that thick contestation, that is to contest the competence of Europe to actually set the rules. So thick contestation is rather rare. The only case in our selection of cases where thick contestation took place was in the case of Turkey and border controls, the chapter that Asli wrote and presented. Fourth point, and conversely, there are many different ways of circumventing, localizing, adapting, changing, or otherwise contesting European rules. So there are very different forms of thin contestation, which may be both hidden and overt, and sometimes at the same time, and sometimes mixed forms, and so on. So I think, again, we can think about the chapter of Veronique and Tina on telecommunications. We have a chapter by Roberto Rocco on banking regulations in Egypt before the Arab uprisings. And that chapter shows clearly that Egyptian authorities talked the talk, but then modified the rules according to the interests of the Egyptian banking sector, the business elites, and their political cronies. We have a chapter on Morocco and Tunisia that was co-written by Mohamed Limam and myself on Morocco and Tunisia's contestation practices vis-a-vis European migration policies. And that chapter shows that hidden and thin contestation was the rule before the Arab uprisings, which often resulted in the criminalization of migration, and that contestation became much more vocal after the uprisings as Europe's pressure on these two countries increased. We have a chapter by Tamiras Fahouri, which also shows that Lebanon's contestation of Europe's ideas of how to deal with refugees after the uprisings is a thin form of contestation at the discursive level for now, right? Fifth point, the volume confirms that contestation is far from being a unidirectional process. That's also what Asli mentioned before, because in some countries, in some cases, countries that traditionally acted as norm receivers may also become norm setters. Then a few points on the issue of power and order in Europe-Middle East relations. So the fact that MENA states seem to favor thin contestation supports the assumption that material power asymmetries do matter. But we also see that MENA states do engage in overt and sometimes even thick contestation on issues in which they have a leverage over Europe. And that at the moment, one of the most important topics here are migration and border controls. So that also means that the power relations between the two sides are much more complex than most existing research acknowledges. And it also compels us to think about the interplay of material power and what we have termed in the book practice power. And finally, where do we go from here? So based on our on the contributions in the book, it is rather clear to us that there is an institutionalized hypocrisy in the EU's attempts to export its order, particularly since it accepts that this order is implemented in a diluted or distorted way. And that also means that this diluted form of European norms, in fact, tend to support crony capitalism and procedural democracy at best. And that's, again, also the point that Raymond Hinnebusch makes in his chapter. So what we actually need are serious studies that focus on the outcome of European policies and not only on discourse and intentions. At the same time, this institutionalized hypocrisy may also lead to a dilution of EU standards within Europe itself. And so we also need more studies that look at the agency of MENA states and their impact on Europe. The question really is the European project sustainable once an empowered MENA region is viewed in purely security terms? So perhaps we need to change a little bit our perspective on relations between Europe and the Mediterranean Middle East. So just last sentence, last words, the book really raised many more questions. And as such, we thought that the book is really a beginning and not the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafaela. We definitely hope the same as well, that this is just the beginning and not the end. And I think these are quite powerful conclusions as well, or first kind of conclusions or thoughts. There are already some questions in the chat, and I'm going to read them to you. Our colleague, Beste Ischlegen, she's saying, congratulations on the very timely book and thanks for the excellent presentations. I have a question to Asli concerning the IBM's promotion of a civilian border agency in Turkey. How credible is the EU's border policy when EU external borders are themselves controlled by the military and increasingly more in recent years? Just an example, the Hellenic Coast Guard is not different from its Turkish counterpart in that both are paramilitary organizations. We also witnessed the mobilization of the military across Europe during summer 2015. In short, and maybe a question to other panelists as well, how credible or effective can EU external action be when internal practices diverge from and even contradict what is being exported? And I think there is also a question from Noor. I'm not sure I'm getting the question, but it's about the institutionalized hypocrisy. How clear it is that there is indeed institutionalized hypocrisy in European order. But I think we can open with these questions and then come back.
Maybe do I get back to Beste's point, Dimitris? Yeah. No, thank you very much, Beste, and it's a very good question. And exactly, actually, this is the same point that the Turkish authorities and Turkey in general has been making vis-a-vis the EU, in terms of that, in fact, in many European member states, border agencies are of military nature. And Greece is given as an example. Finland is generally given as an example. And for example, Finland is considered by the EU the masters of the border control also. And so exactly the same point, and this is also, I think, one way of contestation is that to ask how they can ask us to have a civilian organization when they don't have this within among the member states. But this point on the civilian organization or not is actually, it's also in a note in the chapter, is very interesting, because the EU answer to that is that, in fact, the EU has never asked for a civilian organization, but just a single professional centralized organization, border guard authority. And that, in fact, it was Turkey who put that this organization was going to be under the Ministry of Interior, civilian, reporting to civilian authorities, in its strategy paper from 2003. And if you ask to the Turkish side, it's much more, no, we put it there because they wanted us to have a civilian. So it's like already, I think this controversy over the source of where this comes from shows that there is quite a bit of friction in this area, and I think the blurred sources of this friction, let's say, is used by both sides to negotiate it in their own terms, let's say. And how credible and effective can EU external action be when internal policies diverge from what they are promoting outside? I think 2 points here. One is that I think this is one case, but it is well beyond, and in migration we see this point made a lot and used also by the so-called periphery to contest actually the authority and the legitimacy of the EU as a rule exporter, because we see this in Turkey or in other countries that, yes, okay, we are supposed to provide international protection in high standards, but what about the asylum conditions and reception conditions, etc., in the EU? So who are you to give us a lesson on this kind of approach is used, and rightly so, I would say. And another issue is that I think there we are also witnessing, because this, for example, the IBM issue, or many reform or efforts of extending rules and standards in the area of migration, when they started in earlier 2000s, they were still restrictive, etc. But I think in this over the last 15-20 years, we have been seeing also a convergence on the EU side towards the ways and ways of managing, let's say, the borders, pushing people out, blocking physically the borders and fences, etc. We have been seeing a development of the EU in its practices converging towards the countries that it used to criticize before. And actually there is a bit of a discrepancy, I think, from these policies that have been promoted starting from the late 90s, early 2000s to the point we have reached right now, and in terms of what the EU does in terms of these prescriptions. So it's a reverse convergence, which I think in the book, that in the introduction, Raffaella and Simone also mentioned, for example, in counterterrorism action, etc. So there is also that. It's a bit like the prescription and the models are a bit following behind, I guess, of what has been happening in practice, where the EU has been approaching more, converging towards more the criticized, earlier on criticized periphery, let's say.
Thank you, Ashley. I think Veronique wants to add something.
Yeah, exactly. What I want to say is that for me, effectiveness does not have to be defined by an act of imposing unilaterally policies. So it was a little bit following what Ashley says, that there is a lot of space for collaboration, bilateral inspiration. And I think when I was meeting the EU experts, so people that were working at the EU institutions, they were aware of how interesting in my case, Morocco was in terms of telecom, and how innovative and daring they were. I think at the personal level, people in the EU realize that that's the way to go. It's just that institutions are sometimes so heavy to change and transform their good old habits. So yeah, for me, it's not because they are not managing in imposing their rules that something is going wrong, or I don't know how to say, but there is space for collaboration. For me, that's the key.
Thank you, Veronique. Rafaela, before I come to you, there is a clarification about this question, and it's about if you could elaborate a bit more on what you mean institutionalized hypocrisy, and whether this is comparable to the question of whether the EU can be regarded as a normative power in general, which stipulates how it undermines its own constitutional values by, for example, keep on trading with human rights violators like China, or the institutionalization of military forces. So this is the question from Noor.
Mm-hmm. So when we talked in our conclusions about institutionalized hypocrisy, it is basically the idea that what is all the basis of the European neighborhood policy, of EU policies over the last 20 years has been to export rules and norms, but in a very selective way, because we're not talking about the big rules. We're not talking about democracy, human rights, rule of law. We're talking about little rules, standards in the economic sector and in other areas. And the problem is obviously that if you try to export a model which is not complete, what MENA states receive and perhaps are also only ready to accept is a very diluted model, a very diluted and distorted European model. And that is something, and as we said before, the contestation of rules and the change of rules or the localization of rules by MENA states is something that is absolutely accepted and expected. But at the same time, if your starting point is that you want to export the European model and European norms, but then you compromise for different reasons, in my view, because what is most important for the European core is the stability of the periphery, stability together with economic interests, right? The moment that you start compromising, the states, they get a diluted form, which, as we have seen, actually has contributed to crony capitalism and perhaps some sort of procedural democracy in the best case, which has contributed to rising inequalities and so on and so forth, right? So this is when we talk about institutionalized hypocrisy. And then at the same point, and this is to follow up on what Ashley was saying, at the same time, this institutionalized hypocrisy also means that there may be a blowback, that standards will be diluted within the European Union itself, right? That Europe starts adopting standards and models of those countries that were criticized previously. And this is also meant, and then we really come to the question of whether the European project is sustainable if this is the type that you engage with your peripheries. And of course, I mean, Dimitris knows that very well, and I think most of my colleagues know that very well. I'm personally very critical towards the normative power Europe idea, right? I think that the EU is normative because it exports rules and practices, but it's not normative on the big norms. It's not normative in terms of really being serious about exporting democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. As I said before, I think most the EU's position and its policies towards MENA can be explained in terms both in terms of what it is, sort of an empire that acts in an empire-like way, and by the interest that these type of empires have, which is stability in the neighborhood, first and foremost.
Thank you, Rafaela. I think Simona wants to add and chip in.
Yeah, no, I guess I wanted to add that there's something I think that we can observe, which just to reinforce the points made about sort of a stickiness of the kind of path that the EU has carved out for itself in its external relations. And this is kind of hard to get away from. And as soon as you, however, start to approach a specific policy area, be it border management or telecommunications, or I also studied this in the energy sector, you kind of quickly see that there is this really huge and obvious gap between sort of, you know, the formal communications, the official lines, the policy, and all the instruments that comes with that derives from that, and sort of what is actually happening. And at the same time, as soon as you start doing some expert interviews or so, you start to really see that everyone are completely aware of this kind of organized or institutionalized hypocrisy in a way. And that's where I think the contribution of the book is, you know, a good starting point for, you know, really we need to kind of just do away with some of the basic assumptions in approaching the issue. And maybe we need new vocabulary. Maybe we need, you know, really new starting points altogether. So yeah, just wanted to add that, I think.
Thank you, Simone. There is an open question by Man. Do you think there is room for cooperation within the periphery on the contestation of EU policies? If so, do you think that such cooperation could provide a larger challenge to EU power and internal cohesion? I don't know who wants to respond to this. I see Magali. Yeah.
Let me unmute my my microphone. First, I'd like to answer that question, but also the issue of institutionalized hypocrisy, which also mirrors the concept of organizational hypocrisy. And the notion of organizational hypocrisy is that organizations, and I would say institutions, I mean institutions, organizations, is very close. Those are very close beasts. The reason why there is something that is perceived as hypocrisy is because organizations and institutions, just the same, are confronted with often with contradictory demands. And in order to satisfy the different audiences that have different and contradicting demands, you have to have some kind of strange messages targeted to both. And the result of it often produces something that is considered hypocrisy. So it probably, what I'm trying to say is that it probably is consubstantial to what organizations and institutions are and do, and cannot really be avoided. And this boils back to an article that I read 2 days ago in Le Monde on lying, and the fact that maybe humans inherently lie, and studies in psychology show that kids already at the age of 2 start lying. And if you have some brain damage, you may be unable to lie, and this cuts you off from any form of sociability, because if you only speak the truth, you become an unbearable person. So this game about, is the EU hypocritical about what it does, what its claims regarding democracy and other things. And it is blamed as a hypocritical actor by states who are just as hypocritical, right? So this is a naming and shaming game between entities, political entities, states on the one, or let's say polities, to encompass both states and international / regional organizations like the EU, where everybody is definitely hypocritical, and the question is maybe who can bluff more and blame the other more, and who's a bit weaker and feels more shame and maybe kneels a bit under the accusation of hypocrisy. Now, on the cooperation between peripheries, yes, I mean, we see that, and so in my terminology, peripheries are inside the empire. So whether bordering, so fringes, these territories on which empires have some kind of ambition of power, but they're not part of the empire. So if we take the EU MENA countries, whether they can cooperate and try to make the EU bend its rules for them, and whether it challenges the order, probably, I don't know, but definitely within the EU, of course, we have seen that, and those are the Visegrad countries. One of the Visegrad countries are definitely this type of example of 4 countries who bundled up and were actually very pro-EU when they joined the EU, and have developed over time some different patterns, more critical patterns. And we have among these countries Poland and Hungary, Czech Republic and Slovakia. And for those who read the news yesterday, the members of the European Parliament from the Fidesz were kicked out of the European People's Party, the Conservative Party in the Parliament, on the basis that they discredit too much, they criticize too much, they jeopardize the rule of law, which is one of the foundational principles of the European Union. So definitely this takes place, and this challenges the EU order, and the EU, and here as well, this is internal hypocrisy. We were talking about external hypocrisy, but there is also internal hypocrisy. How long can the EU take such contestation without acting against, right? But yes, definitely the answer is it takes place, and it does pose a real challenge to the European Union.
Thank you. That's indeed true. I think Veronique wants to chip in.
Yeah. Just a short note on this question of collaboration within peripheries. I think what I saw with the case of Morocco was that Morocco is trying to reclaim its position as an emancipative power also within Africa. And actually what I see is that there are a lot more interesting partners for Morocco nowadays, and maybe you can see it even more, but there is a lot more people to choose from where they get the interest. And for me, I don't think it has to be dramatic for Europe. Europe just has to understand that time are changing. For me, that's one of the important lessons, and that's hard to understand, that maybe Europe shouldn't be this superpower anymore, and it's not the case anymore. It's just hard for the institutions to understand it. But Morocco has already gone through the past quite far.
Thank you, Veronique. Rafaela?
Yes. Just one sentence on the organized and on the institutionalized hypocrisy, just to follow up on Magali. Very interesting. I also believe that it's somehow part of international relations, how things work. But I also believe that as academics and as scholars, we should be very careful not to follow the narratives of the institutions we study, right? And on the cooperation between the peripheries, in my case, I would say peripheries are the states in North Africa and the Middle East. Now, as I always tell my students, it is very easy to criticize the European Union for its policies, and all fine and well with that. But of course, the MENA states also have their responsibilities if things are the way they are, right? And certainly, while on the one hand, the European Union has really established a hub and spoke system in which Europe is at the center and has basically bilateral relations with the single MENA states, it's also true that cooperation among MENA states, so that they could also contest together, has been very low, right? There are a lot of conflicts and issues going on between the different Arab states in North Africa and the Middle East. If we take Israel inside, then it becomes even more complicated. If we add Turkey, it becomes even more complicated. So there has also not been there have not been consistent attempts by MENA states to face the European Union together, and that is also their fault, right? The fault of the regimes and the states.
Thank you, Rafaela. I'm not sure if anyone wants to add any concluding or final thoughts or observations or comments. Simone, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of maybe perhaps, of course, this book, we worked on this book for the period up until a couple of years ago. I remember publishing this book, it took quite a while, and we published it with the university press. It takes even longer time. So some water has run under the bridge since. Now I think the trends, however, are still quite clear in that sense, and I mean it is quite remarkable, I think, to see the continuity in the discourse. Okay, if we keep at that level, right? So there's this the 2018 European Commission communication establishing this new financial instrument, and it was entitled "A Modern Budget for a Union that Protects, Empowers and Defends." And I thought, this is very, very much in line with what we saw in the borderlands approach, right? It is still very much seeing itself as that. And those might be seen as kind of constitutive norms of the European Union. It's seeing once it's kind of let's go of those. The question is what is left. It is already a very complex internal structure, and making sense of its foreign policy even more complicated. So I do still, I very much think that there is so much scope for the periphery countries to organize. And I think one way of kind of looking at that is through more of these more technical network exercises or platforms. And some of them exist in some policy areas, right? But when you go beyond a kind of threshold of the political or the diplomatic, where things tend to kind of get stuck, so that there is a kind of a different more transnational level of interaction. And you see that again, for example, in the energy field, where there are some kind of developments of putting engineers together, and you get completely different kind of conversations as when you have to have formal energy policies of those states getting together. So I don't know, the Union for the Mediterranean kind of needs to be included, I think, as some kind of interesting animal. It looks very much like replicating many of the old discourses and kind of practices or patterns of cooperation, but perhaps there is scope. Just to end perhaps on a positive note.
Shall we take this as an indication that a follow-up is coming soon to this book? Maybe? Great. I hope it will. Thank you all for being with us today and making the time to be here and to present the book and the different chapters as well. A big thanks to our audience for being quite active with questions as well. And last but not least, a big thank you to my colleagues from the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, Gijs, Lisa, and Kertu for all their technical help and support with this event. Thank you all. Have a nice afternoon and stay safe and well.